The air in the grand ballroom of the Palais des Nations was thin, filtered to a clinical perfection that tasted of ozone and expensive champagne. Below the vaulted ceilings of Geneva, the world's power brokers moved in a slow tectonic waltz. Men and women who didn't use guns to change the world, but signatures and whispers. In the center of this gilded hive, Dae-hyun stood like a splash of drying blood against a sea of monochrome. His suit was a deep, midnight maroon, the silk catching the light with a predatory shimmer that commanded the room without uttering a word. Beside him, Zara was a vision of architectural elegance, her gown a structured silver that moved like liquid mercury, her unblinking gaze dissecting the crowd with the precision of an algorithm. 5 years of legitimacy had polished them into a sovereign unit, yet as Dae-hyun adjusted the cuff of his maroon sleeve, he felt the familiar prickle of a trap. In Seoul, he had fought wolves. Here, he was surrounded by architects. "They aren't looking at us as peers, Zara," Dae-hyun murmured, his voice a low, lethal vibration that barely carried over the string quartet. He didn't turn his head, his eyes tracking the reflection of a Swiss diplomat in his champagne flute. "They're looking at us as an untapped resource." Zara's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his arm. "They see a shipping empire that spans 3 continents and a history they can use as blackmail. They think the monster is a leash they can pull." The realization crystallized when Julian Vane approached. He was a man of indeterminate age and infinite refinement, his smile as sharp and hollow as a razor. He represented the consulate, a collective that existed in the white spaces of international law. He didn't offer a hand. He offered a challenge draped in a compliment. "Mr. Han, Mrs. Han," Vane began, his voice smooth as glass. "Your transition to the light has been inspiring. Most men with your pedigree end up in a ditch or a cell. To see you here, controlling the very veins of global commerce, is a testament to your ambition, or perhaps, your utility." Dae-hyun's jaw tightened, the maroon fabric of his suit feeling suddenly like a suit of armor in a room where no one used swords. "My utility is my own, Mr. Vane. The Han Group moves goods, not agendas." Vane chuckled, a dry, papery sound. He leaned in closer, the scent of his cologne something ancient and cold. "You misunderstand the nature of the room, Dae-hyun. You spent years cleaning your name so you could sit at this table. But the table is built on the very shadows you tried to escape. We don't want to expose your past, we want to curate your future. You've built the perfect, legitimate vessel for our interests. To refuse us would be messy for your son." The mention of Haru was a silent explosion. The Geneva silhouette was no longer a gala. It was a crime scene. Zara didn't flinch, but her emerald eyes turned into chips of ice. They had spent half a decade building a world of glass, thinking it was transparent and clean, only to realize that glass was the easiest thing to see through, and the easiest thing to shatter. As Vane drifted back into the crowd, leaving them standing in the center of the marble floor, the maroon of Dae-hyun's suit seemed to darken. The trap was set, and their legitimacy wasn't a shield, it was a target. The global elite didn't fear the monster of Seoul. They had been waiting for him to get clean enough to be used. "We aren't leaving," Zara whispered, her voice a promise of war. "We're going to show them that a monster in a suit is still a monster." The return to Seoul felt less like a homecoming and more like a tactical retreat into a bunker made of glass. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of soft silks and nursery rhymes, had aged into a silent museum of power. Haru was 5 years old now, a quiet boy, with his mother's unblinking emerald gaze and a shock of hair that promised to turn the same haunting silver as his father's. He did not play with the erratic energy of other children. He moved through the vast minimalist halls with a deliberate, haunting grace that made the seasoned security detail straighten their ties in his presence. Dae-hyun stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the study, his maroon suit jacket draped over a chair, watching his son through the open door. Haru was sitting at the massive mahogany table in the dining room, but he wasn't coloring. He was dismantling a complex mechanical watch, a rare vintage piece Dae-hyun had left on the sideboard. The boy's small fingers moved with a terrifying surgical precision, laying out the gears and springs in a perfect, descending line of size and function. He didn't look frustrated. He didn't look curious. He looked like he was performing an audit. "He hasn't spoken a word since we got back from Geneva," Zara said, stepping up beside Dae-hyun. She was dressed in a sharp slate-gray power suit, her eyes reflecting the same concern that gnawed at Dae-hyun's gut. "He just watches. He watches the guards. He watches the monitors. And he watches us." "He's looking for the seams," Dae-hyun whispered. "He's trying to figure out how the world is put together so he can decide how to take it apart." The chillingly calm intelligence Haru displayed wasn't the precociousness of a gifted child. It was the dormant monster of the Han line, waking up in a new, more efficient vessel. When one of the new security recruits, a man who hadn't yet learned the weight of the family he served, approached the table to retrieve the watch, Haru didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He simply spoke, his voice a soft, flat resonance that chilled the air. "The third gear is chipped," the boy said, his eyes still fixed on the internal mechanisms. "That's why the rhythm was wrong. It's a flaw in the design. You should replace the whole assembly, not just the part." The guard froze, looking at the child as if he were an ancient spirit inhabiting a small body. Dae-hyun felt a cold shiver trace the line of his spine. It wasn't just the technical knowledge. It was the absolute clinical detachment. Haru wasn't interested in the watch's beauty or its history. He was interested in its failure. Later that evening, as the city lights began to crawl up the glass walls of the penthouse, Dae-hyun found Haru standing in the nursery, the room that had once held the iron cradle. The boy was staring at the blank space on the floor, where the monstrosity had once sat before Dae-hyun had it melted down. "Father?" Haru asked, his voice barely a whisper in the dark. "Why do the people in the elevators look afraid when you walk in? Is it the color of your suit?" Dae-hyun knelt, bringing himself level with his son. He saw the heir's shadow stretching out behind the boy, long and jagged in the moonlight. "They aren't afraid of the suit, Haru. They're afraid of the responsibility I carry." "No," Haru replied, finally turning his unblinking gaze toward his father. A small knowing smile touched his lips, one that didn't reach his eyes. "They're afraid because they know you can see the chips in their gears, just like I can." Dae-hyun pulled the boy into a hug, but the warmth felt one-sided. Haru didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. He remained still, a silent observer of his father's heartbeat. The world Julian Vane had described in Geneva, a world where they were assets to be managed, was already manifesting in their own home. Their son wasn't just an heir to a shipping empire. He was an heir to a darkness that legitimacy couldn't wash away. The shadow was growing, and as Haru looked over his father's shoulder at the city below, it was clear he wasn't looking for a playground. He was looking at a map. The silence of the penthouse at 3 a.m. was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet of a deep-sea trench. Zara sat in the glow of 6 panoramic monitors, her face bathed in a flickering ultraviolet light that made her emerald eyes look like gemstones submerged in water. She was no longer the elegant hostess of Geneva or the watchful mother of the afternoon. She was the architect, Dian, and she had found a rot in the foundation of her greatest creation. For months, The Han Group's global logistics software, a proprietary system she had designed to be the most secure encryption layer in the shipping world, had been performing with uncanny, perfect efficiency. Too perfect. Her fingers flew across the glass interface, peeling back layers of code that she had written with her own hands. At first, it appeared as a minor latency in the Singapore to Rotterdam route. A heartbeat skipped in the data stream. But as she bypassed the primary firewalls and dove into the kernel of the system, she found it. The Ghost Protocol. It was a backdoor of such breathtaking sophistication that it felt less like a hack and more like a twin. Someone had not just broken into her system, they had mirrored it, decreating a ghost layer that ran parallel to their legitimate operations. While the Han Group's manifests showed crates of medical supplies and luxury electronics moving across the oceans, the ghost layer was piggybacking on those same vessels, using the Han Group's diplomatic green channel status to move cargo that didn't exist on any legal ledger. Dae-hyun, she whispered into the comms, her voice a sharp, clinical blade that cut through the silence of the suite. Minutes later, he appeared in the doorway, the deep maroon of his silk robe catching the blue light of the screens. He didn't ask if she was sure. He saw the way her jaw was set, the unblinking intensity of her focus. He moved to her side, his hand resting on the back of her chair, his gaze following the cascading lines of red code that were now beginning to flag unauthorized access points in real time. "It's Julian Vane," Zara said, her voice dropping to that low, lethal vibrato. "The consulate didn't just want to use our ships. They've already turned our entire network into a Trojan horse. Every vessel we have at sea right now is carrying a shadow. If one of them is searched, if a single ghost crate is opened, the clean Han legacy ends in an international tribunal." Dae-hyun looked at the map, seeing the hundreds of tiny white dots representing their fleet, his fleet, now transformed into a swarm of potential landmines. The legitimacy they had sacrificed so much for was being weaponized against them. Vane wasn't just a predator. He was a parasite that had hollowed them out from the inside. "They used our own desire for transparency to hide their movements," Dae-hyun observed, his tattooed knuckles whitening as he gripped the chair. "They knew we wouldn't look for a ghost in a house we thought we had scrubbed clean." "I can't just shut it down," Zara said, her fingers pausing over a line of corrupted logic. "The protocol is hardwired into the navigation arrays. If I kill the ghost, I kill the ships. They'll lose power in the middle of the ocean, or worse, their GPS will drift into restricted waters. It's a dead man's switch, Dae-hyun. We are being steered by a hand we can't see." The Ghost Protocol was the ultimate insult to Zara's genius. It was a mirror held up to their lives, showing them that no matter how much they polished the surface, the dark would always find a way to inhabit the structure. As the sun began to bleed over the Seoul horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the office, the couple realized they were no longer sailing their own ship. They were passengers on a ghost fleet, heading toward a destination chosen by a man who viewed their son as an asset and their honor as a joke. The private lounge of the Metropolitan Club in London was a fortress of neoclassical arrogance, all white marble pillars and leather-bound secrets. It was a space designed to make even kings feel like trespassers, yet as Dae-hyun crossed the threshold, the room's gravity seemed to shift toward him. He wore a tailored maroon suit of such deep, arterial intensity that it appeared black in the shadows. His silver hair swept back like a frozen storm. He didn't look like a man seeking an audience. He looked like a predator entering a cage he had already decided to dismantle. Julian Vane was seated by a roaring fireplace, swirling a glass of amber liquid that cost more than a common man's annual salary. He didn't rise. He simply gestured toward the velvet chair opposite him with a smile that was as sterile as a surgical suite. "The maroon suit," Vane noted, his voice smooth and frictionless. A bold choice for a man trying to convince the world he's no longer covered in blood, Dae-hyun. Or is it a warning? A reminder of the monster beneath the fine wool? Dae-hyun sat, his movements slow and deliberate, his unblinking gaze locking onto Vane's with a weight that made the air in the room feel heavy. The color is irrelevant, Julian. A man who has lived in the dark knows that a suit is just a skin. What matters is the intent of the man wearing it. And your intent, currently, is to stop the Ghost Protocol. Vane countered, leaning back into the marble-cold silence of the lounge. Zara is a genius, truly. Her attempts to excise our ghost layer have been quite entertaining to watch from the server rooms in Zurich. But you must understand the mathematics of your situation. You spent 5 years building a pedestal of legitimacy. That pedestal is made of glass. If you break our protocol, the glass shatters, and you fall back into the mud with the rest of the street thugs. Dae-hyun leaned forward, the firelight dancing in the cold depths of his eyes. You talk about the monster as if it's a weakness you can exploit. You think because I've learned to speak your language and wear your clothes, I've forgotten how to find a throat in the dark. You have clean hands, Julian, because you hire others to do your killing. But clean hands are often weak ones. They've never had to hold the blade. Vane's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, the first crack in his porcelain mask. Violence is a primitive lever, Dae-hyun. We are playing a game of systems. If a Han ship is found carrying the consulate's ghost cargo, it isn't a murder charge you'll face. It's an international sanctions list. You'll be a pariah. Your son's future will be a series of frozen accounts and denied visas. Is that the legacy you want for Haru? The mention of his son brought a stillness to Dae-hyun that was more terrifying than any outburst. He didn't move, yet the maroon of his suit seemed to pulse with a dark, contained energy. How you think you've cornered me with your ledgers and your protocols? You think the law is your shield. But the law only works if everyone agrees to play by the rules. I am the man who broke the rules of the oldest syndicates in Asia. I didn't survive my father just to be managed by a man who hides behind marble pillars. Dae-hyun stood, the height of his frame casting a long, jagged shadow over Vane. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. The psychological dominance was total. The Ghost Protocol is your lifeline, Julian. If you use it to touch my family again, I won't just kill you. I will dismantle the consulate piece by piece until there is nowhere on this glass continent for people like you to hide. My hands might be stained, but they are very, very strong. As Dae-hyun turned to leave, his footsteps echoing like gavel strikes on the marble floor, Vane sat in the sudden chill of the room, his amber liquid finally still. The verbal duel was over, but the war had just shifted into a higher, more dangerous gear. Dae-hyun wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a sovereign who had remembered his teeth. The humidity of Singapore hung over the Jurong port like a wet shroud, heavy with the scent of brine and industrial grease. Under the blinding glare of the harbor floodlights, the Han Sovereign, a state-of-the-art container ship, sat motionless, a leviathan caught in a net. It wasn't the usual harbor master or a routine customs team that had boarded her. It was a tactical unit of the International Maritime Enforcement Agency, their black uniforms slick with the midnight rain. The Singapore Sting had been executed with the surgical coldness of a Vane-inspired masterpiece, and as the news reached the penthouse in Seoul, the clean world Zara and Dae-hyun had built began to tilt on its axis. Zara stood in the command center, her face a mask of frozen rage as she watched the live feed from a drone circling the dock. On the screen, she saw the boarding party breaching the hull of a specific unmarked container, one that her system insisted didn't exist. This was the physical manifestation of the Ghost Protocol. When the doors were pried open, the infrared cameras didn't find the medical supplies listed on the manifest. Instead, they revealed rows of high-grade, unlicensed biometric processors, technology restricted under global security treaties. They didn't just hide the cargo, Zara whispered, her fingers hovering over the keys as she watched the legal trap snap shut. They timed the inspection to coincide with the opening of the European markets. In 1 hour, the Han Group won't be a shipping company. We'll be an international arms trafficker. Dae-hyun stood behind her, still wearing the maroon suit from his flight back from London. The deep, blood-red fabric seemed to absorb the flickering light of the monitors, making him look like a shadow cast by the impending crisis. He watched as the captain of the Han Sovereign, a man who had served the Han family for 20 years, was forced to his knees on the deck, a rifle barrel pressed against his neck. "Vane isn't just trying to ruin us," Dae-hyun said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register. "He's forcing us to choose. Either we disavow the ship and let our people rot in a Singaporean prison, or we admit the Ghost Protocol exists and reveal that we've lost control of our own empire." The scandal was already spreading through the digital ether like a virus. News crawlers began to flash across the secondary screens. Han Group vessel seized in Singapore. Illegal tech shipment revealed. The stock price began its jagged downward descent, a visual representation of their legitimacy bleeding out in real time. For 5 years, they had played the game of transparency, but Vane had used that very transparency to build a stage for their execution. Zara turned from the screen, her unblinking gaze meeting Dae-hyun's. "If the IMEA traces the encryption back to my server, they won't find Vane's ghost. They'll find my signature. He's made it look like I designed the back door for our own profit." "Then we stop playing the victim," Dae-hyun replied, his hand resting on the hilt of the silver-plated pistol he had reclaimed from the safe. "Vane thinks he can win this with a press release and a tactical team. He's forgotten that the only thing more dangerous than a monster in the dark is a king with nothing left to lose." As the sirens wailed across the Singapore docks and the world began to scream for answers, the couple stood in the silence of their high-tech fortress. The sting was meant to be the end of their era, but as Dae-hyun looked at the drone feed of his ship being occupied by foreign boots, the monster didn't just wake up, it evolved. The battle for the Han Sovereign was lost, but the war for the glass continent had just become personal. The penthouse felt less like a palace and more like a panopticon as the digital walls began to close in. Outside, the world was screaming for an explanation for the Han Sovereign, but inside the sanctum of the command center, Zara had entered a state of absolute icy stillness. She had traded her silver gown for a black silk shift that made her skin look like marble, her fingers poised over the keyboard like a concert pianist preparing for a dirge. To save the legacy she had built, she had to return to the place she had spent 5 years trying to forget. The dark, unmapped corridors of the deep web where her legend as the architect had first been forged. The burden of her genius was the knowledge that her own perfection was being used as a shroud. Vane hadn't just used a back door. He had woven the Ghost Protocol into the very core of her original source code, making it look as though the betrayal was her own design. To prove the consulate's interference, she had to descend into the shadow net, an anonymous layer of the internet where state secrets and human lives were bartered like commodities. It was a place where legitimacy was a joke, and her public reputation, the carefully curated image of the visionary corporate leader, would be the first thing to burn if she were detected. "If the authorities catch me in these servers, Dae-hyun, it won't matter what I find," Zara said, her voice a low, steady frequency that belied the tension in her frame. A CEO caught in the shadow net is a CEO who is already guilty. I'm stepping off the map. Dae-hyun stood behind her, his maroon suit jacket discarded, his tattooed arms crossed over his chest. He was the physical wall between her and the world, but he couldn't protect her from the data. Go, he rasped. I'll handle the board. I'll give them enough blood to keep them from looking at your screens. As she dove deeper, the monitors transformed into a chaotic rain of crimson and black data. She bypassed encrypted relay nodes in Talon and ghost servers in the Caymans, her mind moving faster than the flickering light could track. She felt the weight of the architect's burden, the terrifying realization that her software had become the nervous system for a global conspiracy. Every time she encountered a firewall, she recognized the signature. Vane hadn't hired a hacker. He had hired a mirror. The countermeasures were designed by someone who understood her logic, someone who anticipated her every move. The risk was total. One false keystroke would trigger a honeypot trap that would broadcast her IP address to every intelligence agency from Langley to Seoul. Her face would be on every screen, not as the mother of the Han heir, but as the architect of a global shadow empire. Yet, she pushed further, her breathing shallow, her unblinking emerald eyes reflecting the digital abyss. Finally, she broke through. Deep within a dormant server farm in the Swiss Alps, she found the prime manifest, the true ledger of the consulate's activities. It wasn't just biometric processors on the Han sovereign. It was a record of every politician, every judge, and every general they had moved across the globe like chess pieces on her ships. The proof was there, but it was wrapped in a digital poison pill that would erase the data the moment it was downloaded. Zara paused, her hand trembling slightly over the glass. She had the truth, but to take it, she had to reveal herself to Vane's watchers. She had to trade her status as a legitimate queen for the reality of being a digital ghost. As the first alert sirens of a security breach began to hum on her console, she looked at the reflection of Dae-hyun in the monitor. She saw the man who had broken his own cycle for her, and she knew what she had to do. With a single defiant stroke, she initiated the transfer, casting her reputation into the fire to save the man and the child who were her only true north. The architect was back in the dark, and this time, she wasn't coming out until she had burned the consulate's world to the ground. The skyline of Seoul was a jagged edge of cold neon, but inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom of the Han Group, the atmosphere was as frigid as an Arctic tomb. For years, the board of directors had been a collection of hand-picked loyalists and seasoned pragmatists, men and women who had profited immensely from the clean era Zara had engineered. But as the clock struck midnight, the air in the room shifted. The loyalty that had been purchased with dividends and growth was being systematically dismantled by an invisible, global hand. This was the silent coup, a war fought not with suppressed pistols or tactical teams, but with stock buyback notifications and predatory shell companies. Dae-hyun stood at the head of the table, his maroon suit a dark bruising stain against the pale cream of the office walls. He did not sit. To sit was to acknowledge the authority of the ghosts in the room. He watched as the directors filed in, their faces pale, their eyes refusing to meet his. These were people he had protected from the street wars of the past, yet they arrived tonight looking like condemned prisoners. "You've been busy," Dae-hyun said, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to make the heavy glass of the boardroom table hum. He didn't look at the paper manifests. He looked at the sweat on the brow of Director Min, the most senior member of the board. "I've seen the transaction logs. A firm out of Luxembourg, another out of the British Virgin Islands, a systematic sweep of the majority shares. You didn't just sell your stock, Min. You sold the ground we stand on." Min's voice was a thin, trembling reed. They offered terms we couldn't refuse. Daehyun. And after the Singapore sting, the IMEA is breathing down our necks. The Han Group's reputation is a liability. The consulate promised stability. They promised to make the ghost disappear. The consulate is the ghost, Daehyun replied, his unblinking gaze narrowing. He realized then that Vane's strategy was total. By creating the scandal in Singapore, the consulate had driven the stock price into the dirt, making the buyout not just possible, but inevitable. The legitimacy Zara had built was the very rope they were using to hang the family. Zara appeared on the large monitor at the end of the room, her image transmitted from her encrypted command center. She looked like a digital deity, her face lit by the ultraviolet glow of the shadow net. They didn't just buy the shares, Daehyun, she interrupted, her voice a cold, sharp blade. They've triggered a morality clause in the corporate charter. By linking the illegal tech in Singapore to the CEO's office, they've authorized an immediate vote of no confidence. They aren't just taking the company, they're stripping you of your legal immunity. The room went silent. This was the true endgame. If Daehyun was no longer the CEO of a global logistics firm, he was merely a man with a violent past and a collection of powerful enemies. The legal shield that protected Haru and their clean life was being dissolved in a series of digital signatures. Sign the resignation, Daehyun, Min whispered, pushing a tablet across the marble surface. Vane said that if you go quietly, the investigation into the Han sovereign will be diverted. The family stays safe. The boy stays in his school. Don't be the monster again. It's bad for business. Daehyun looked at the tablet, then at the faces of the men he had enriched. He felt the old, primal hunger rising in his blood, the desire to lock the doors and ensure none of them ever saw the sunrise. But he looked at Zara's image on the screen, and he saw the data she had stolen from the Swiss servers. The consulate thought they had won because they owned the paper, but they had forgotten that a sovereign doesn't need a board of directors to rule. You think you've bought a throne? Daehyun said, his voice dropping into a register that made Min flinch. He didn't sign the tablet. Instead, he crushed it under his heel, the glass shattering with a sound like a breaking bone. But you've only bought a burning building. You can have the chairs and you can have the name. But the Han legacy doesn't live in a ledger. It lives in the man you were too afraid to kill. As the board members scrambled to retrieve their phones, realizing the silent part of the coup was over, Daehyun turned his back on them. The corporate war was lost, but the real war, the one where the maroon suit would be stained with more than just wine, was only beginning. The roar of the corporate world faded into the rhythmic, salt-heavy pulse of the Jeju Strait as the private helicopter banked toward the family's most secluded asset. The island sanctuary was a jagged tooth of volcanic rock and lush cedar, rising from the emerald waters like a secret held by the earth itself. To the international press, it was a billionaire's hideaway. To Daehyun and Zara, it was a killing box. They had retreated here not to hide, but to force the consulate into a terrain where legitimacy was a dead language. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of violet and gold, the island's high-tech defenses hummed to life. Haru sat in the center of the reinforced villa, his small hands steady as he helped Zara monitor the perimeter. He didn't ask why they were there. He simply watched the thermal feeds with that chilling, analytical silence that had become his hallmark. He was no longer just a child. He was the passenger in a war machine. The attack didn't begin with a bang. It began with the invisibility of the modern age. The consulate's mercenaries arrived not in loud boats, but via subsurface gliders, clad in adaptive camouflage suits that blurred their silhouettes against the jungle foliage. They were ghosts of the digital era, equipped with heartbeat sensors and acoustic dampeners that made them nearly silent. But the maroon of Dae-hyun's suit had been replaced by tactical black, and his eyes had returned to the cold, predatory focus of the mountain. "They've breached the southern cliffside," Zara whispered, her fingers dancing over a holographic display that flickered with the movement of displaced air. 4 signatures. They're using cloaking tech that bleeds into the ambient heat. To the sensors, they're just warm wind. Dae-hyun stood in the shadows of the veranda, a suppressed rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't look for the men, he looked for the patterns. He knew that even a ghost had to disturb the grass, and even a shadow had to breathe. "Let them come closer," he rasped, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the crashing waves below. Vane wants to prove that his technology can hunt a legend. He's forgotten that a trap only works if the prey doesn't know it's a cage. The game of cat and mouse unfolded in the velvet dark of the cedar groves. The mercenaries moved with clinical efficiency, leapfrogging toward the villa, confident in their invisibility. They didn't see the tripwires made of monofilament wire, nor did they hear the soft click of the directional claymores Zara had repurposed from the old Han armory. When the first explosion blossomed, a silent, localized burst of shrapnel, the invisibility of the consulate was shattered. Dae-hyun moved through the trees like a wraith, his knowledge of the island's geography, a weapon that no software could counter. He appeared and vanished, a dark shape in the periphery of their night vision goggles. He didn't fire from a distance, he took them from the shadows, using the environment to dismantle their high-tech arrogance. He was the monster once more, but this time he was fighting with the tactical brilliance Zara had instilled in him. Inside the villa, Zara watched the HUD as the 4 red dots vanished one by one. She felt the architect's burden shifting. It wasn't just about protecting the data anymore. It was about protecting the blood. She looked at Haru, who was watching a monitor showing a mercenary's thermal signature fading to blue as the life left him. "Is it over, Mother?" Haru asked, his emerald eyes reflecting the cold light of the screen. "No, Haru," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "It's just beginning. They've realized the island isn't a sanctuary. It's a grave." By the time the moon reached its zenith, the cedar groves were silent again. The high-tech mercenaries lay scattered in the dirt, their expensive gear useless against a man who had been born in the mud and a woman who had mastered the light. But as Dae-hyun stepped back into the villa, his chest heaving, his gaze met Zara's. They both knew the consulate wouldn't stop with a single squad. The island had held for now, but the world was still watching, and Vane was still holding the keys to their reputation. The sacrifice was coming, and it would have to be total. The aftermath of the island skirmish left a scent of ozone and iron that clung to the air, a reminder that the clean world was an illusion they could no longer afford. To save the Han name, Dae-hyun realized he had to become the very thing the world feared most, a ghost of the past summoned to haunt the present. He stood in the dimly lit armory of the villa, the maroon silk of his suit sleeves rolled back to reveal the intricate, coiled dragons of his heritage. He wasn't just preparing for a fight, he was preparing a performance for a global audience of one. "If I do this, Zara, the footage will be everywhere," Dae-hyun said, his voice a hollow echo against the stone walls. "The world won't see a CEO defending his family. They'll see the monster of soul finally reverting to his true nature. The stock will bottom out. The board will have their proof." Zara stepped into the light, her eyes reflecting a fierce, tragic understanding. She held a tablet that was already broadcasting a secure, encrypted feed to Julian Vane's private servers. "Vane won't come out for a businessman. He'll only come out to witness the collapse of your soul. He needs to see you break, Dae-hyun. He needs to see you become your father so he can claim he was the one who civilized the Han legacy. The sovereign sacrifice began at dawn. Through a series of carefully staged leaks and hacked surveillance feeds, the world watched as Dae-hyun seemingly snapped. He bypassed the legal channels, appearing at a consulate-linked black site in the suburbs of Incheon. On camera, he moved with a brutal, unrefined ferocity that bypassed tactical grace for raw terror. He didn't use the surgical precision of his recent years. He used the blunt force trauma of the old syndicates. He tore through the consulate's mid-level assets, so leaving a trail of wreckage that looked like the work of a madman, not a sovereign. The media erupted. The Han reversion became the headline of the hour. In London, Julian Vane watched the feed with a growing sense of triumphalist glee. He saw Dae-hyun standing in the ruins of a warehouse. Blood, whether his own or another's, it was impossible to tell, staining the sleeve of his maroon suit. To Vane, this was the ultimate victory. He had stripped the Han family of their sophistication and forced them back into the dirt. "He's broken," Vane whispered to his associates, his fingers hovering over the glass of his desk. "The legend is dead. Now, we go in and finish the audit. We take the company, we take the boy, and we erase the father." Lured by the scent of a dying god, Vane finally broke his own rule of anonymity. He boarded a private jet for Seoul, intending to oversee the final liquidation of the Han Group in person. He believed he was going to a funeral. He didn't realize he was walking into a theater. Back at the penthouse, Zara watched the tracking data on Vane's flight with an unblinking gaze. Every savage act Dae-hyun had performed was a calculated breadcrumb, a piece of digital theater designed to trigger Vane's arrogance. The blood on Dae-hyun's suit was a costume. The rage in his eyes was a mask. By pretending to lose his humanity, he had gained the only advantage that mattered, Vane's physical presence. Dae-hyun stood in the center of the dark penthouse, waiting for the arrival of the man who thought he had won. He looked at his hands. They were steady, despite the violence he had just pantomimed. He had sacrificed his reputation, his public face, and perhaps his future in the light, but as he heard the distant hum of an approaching motorcade, he knew the trade was worth it. The monster was a role he could play, but the father was the man he would die to protect. The glass doors of the penthouse didn't shatter when Julian Vane entered. They slid open with a quiet, expensive hiss, welcoming the victor to his new kingdom. Vane walked into the dim expanse of the living room with the gait of a man who had already seen the end of the movie. He was flanked by two silent men in charcoal suits, their eyes scanning for a threat that Vane believed had already been neutered. In the center of the room, seated in a high-backed leather chair, Dae-hyun waited. The maroon of his suit was dark, almost black in the twilight, and he looked every bit the ruined king the cameras had portrayed, exhausted, blood-spattered, and defeated. "The performance was spectacular, Dae-hyun," Vane said, his voice echoing with a hollow, cultured warmth. He came to a halt 5 paces away, his hands folded neatly in front of his pristine suit. "The world thinks you've lost your mind. The IMEA has a warrant, the board has a replacement, and your son. Well, Haru will be raised by the consulate now. A clean slate for a brilliant mind." Dae-hyun didn't move. He didn't even look up. "You talk about the world as if it's a ledger you've finished auditing, Julian. You think because you own the headlines, you own the truth." "I own the consequences," Vane countered, a thin, sharp smile cutting across his face. "And the consequence of your reversion is that you are no longer a sovereign. You're just a ghost in a very expensive suit." "Then you should have looked closer at the ghosts." A voice drifted from the darkness behind the monitors. Zara stepped into the light, her face a mask of absolute terrifying calm. She held no weapon, only a small obsidian black tablet. You came here to witness a collapse, Julian, but you're only witnessing a transfer of data. She tapped the screen. Suddenly, every monitor in the room, and as Vane's phone began to vibrate frantically, every screen in his network erupted into a cascade of light. It wasn't the footage of Daehyun's violence. It was the prime manifest Zara had stolen from the Swiss servers, now decrypted and broadcast not to the public, but to the rivals of the consulate. Every judge they had bribed, every general they had moved, and every ghost cargo they had ever shipped was being laid bare to the very people who would be most incentivized to destroy them. Vane's face went the color of ash. What have you done? You've just signed your own death warrant. If the consulate falls, the vacuum will pull you in first. The consulate isn't falling, Daehyun said, finally standing up. His fatigue vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory grace. He wiped a smudge of stage blood from his cheek with a silk handkerchief. It's being liquidated, and we aren't the ones being audited. You are. In that moment, Vane realized the unwritten law of their world. Power wasn't about legitimacy or violence. It was about the ability to survive the exposure of both. By pretending to revert to a monster, Daehyun had drawn the consulate's master out of the shadows. By broadcasting the manifest, Zara had turned the consulate's own allies into their executioners. Vane wasn't being arrested. He was being deleted by the very system he had helped build. The two men flanking Vane checked their own devices. They didn't look at Daehyun with hostility. They looked at Vane with a sudden clinical detachment. Without a word, they turned and walked out the door, leaving their employer standing alone in a room that no longer belonged to him. The game was over. But as the silence reclaimed the penthouse, there was no sense of triumph. Zara walked over to Daehyun, her hand finding his. They looked at the screens, where the data was still flowing. Names they didn't recognize. Organizations that dwarfed the Han Group. And a global web of influence that made the consulate look like a local gang. We didn't end the game, did we? Zara whispered, her emerald eyes reflecting the infinite red lines of the global network. No, Daehyun replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise over a world they had just fundamentally changed. We just graduated to a darker table. The monster and the architect are gone, Zara. But the sovereigns have just been invited to the real war. They stood together in the ruins of their old life, the maroon suit a reminder of the blood they were willing to spill, realizing that their clean world was just a single room in a house that spanned the entire globe, and the doors were finally open.